All right, people are coming in. Hi, Emily, Tess and Cynthia, um, Geraldine, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. If you wanna just put in the chat where you're watching us from, what brought you here. Yes, Emily in Columbia, Maryland. Um, Let us know. Yeah, what brought you here tonight? It's like we have about half the people we should have. Got someone from Avon, Geraldine from Avon. These are fake books behind me. I'm not at the Mark Twain house. That is closed up for the evening. Just at home in West Hartford. Hi, Joanne. Joanne in Las Vegas. St. Paul, Minnesota. Awesome. Hope to be going to that part of the world next summer. My partner's from that part of the world. Los Angeles. Awesome. Cool. I love when we have people from outside of the Northeast.
Right.
Awesome. Okay, so let's get started. Hi, if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. Thanks so much for joining us for this virtual program for The Money Kings, the epic story of the Jewish immigrants who transformed Wall Street and shaped modern America. First, I need to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are incredibly happy to honor his memory with these programs, and we are also very grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. I know some of you are members, but if you're not, please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member. All members receive free admission to our author programs, both virtual and in person. You receive free admission to the house and museum. You get year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and there are much more benefits than that I can list at this moment. But if you have any questions, please put something in the chat, and I'll reach out to you. You can also visit our website if you want some more information. Now on to our guests. Our author, Daniel Schulman, is the Deputy Washington Bureau Chief of Mother Jones and the best-selling author of Sons of Wichita, a biography of the Koch family that was a finalist for the Financial Times and McKinsey Business Book of the Year Award. Our moderator, Dan Hart, is a columnist and the associate editor at Hearst Connecticut Media Group. He writes about the intersection of business, public policy, and politics, and how the issues affect the people of Connecticut. So during this event, we encourage you to have a conversation with each other in the chat. If you have a specific question, though, please put that into the Q&A sections just on the bottom left of the screen. We just want to make sure your questions don't get lost in the chat if we're having a conversation. And I'll be putting a link in the chat to purchase the book. Please be an active audience. We love that. So that's all from me. I will turn this over to Daniel and Dan. Please sit back and enjoy.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for being here. A special thanks to Suzanne Hopgood with in memory of Frank Lord. Sorry about that. And thanks to the Mark Twain House. So Daniel, this is quite a sweeping history. It is about a social history, a business history, a political history, a financial history. There's so much here. And of course, the subtitle of the book is how these Jewish banking houses and these money kings shaped the country. In what ways, both obvious and not obvious, just as a starting overview, would you say that they shaped this world that we're in right now?
My goodness, it goes from, Wall Street itself to some of the economic policies that undergird our country, from things like the Federal Reserve to the progressive income tax, and well beyond that. But one of the biggest impacts this group had was on Jewish American life in America. If you are are of Russian or Eastern European descent from a Jewish background, as I am, there's a good chance you would not be here absent this group of individuals. They also played a major cultural role in this country. Museums, libraries, you name it, and also as well as politics.
And so before we get into the characters, including, I think, the central character, Jacob Schiff, who bridges the gap between the old world 19th century and the modern 20th century banking worlds, that really is the linchpin character in the book, in my view. And before we get to him and who he was and who he was all about, is there a defining characteristic, I think, in the mind's eye of many people who are not familiar with this, and some who are, there may be a defining characteristic of what this culture was. Who were these people? Did they have a certain style? Did they have a certain politics, a way of being? Or was it just that they all happened to be Jewish bankers building the modern world? That's enough.
So I think the first wave of these bankers had something in common, and I'm talking about sort of the Lehman brothers, Marcus Goldman, the people that originally founded some of these banks. And really, they were men of very modest means, all of whom came from Germany, many of them from Bavaria. And they were fleeing a country where there were very few opportunities for Jews. You were not able to hold many professional jobs. You could not live in many places. In fact, the Lehman brothers ended up leaving where they lived just because there were quota systems about how many Jews could live in a particular town, and they could no longer live there. They also shared in common that they were fairly adventurous in that they were willing to come to the United States, and not only that, but venture into places like Alabama, which were where there weren't many people, where they didn't know the culture, and it was sort of a crash course for them in business. In fact, one of the great grandsons of one of the Lehman brothers said peddling was the Harvard Business School for Jewish boys, and there was certainly an element of truth to this, in which they sort of very quickly came to the United States and got a crash course in business. Now, later generations, they were very much bound by their German background and their religion. And at that time, there really weren't very many Jewish people in the United States. So it made sense that they formed very close ties.
Mm-hmm. So they're not, starting with Joseph Seligman, who comes from, is it Mannheim? Is it Bavaria?
Beiersdorf, yeah.
Yeah, right, Beiersdorf. He comes and he eventually gets to Alabama. He comes at a very young age by himself, and he later sends for his 7 brothers, most of whom make it over here, or some of whom. He's sort of the progenitor, right? Before we get to anybody else, he's the progenitor. You see him as, and he becomes an Alabama peddler, as you say.
Yeah.
And do you see him as the great progenitor, or do you see there being a sort of a gradual progression? In other words, is there something great about Joseph Seligman, or does he just happen to be the first person who arrives along with his brothers and early leaders?
I think there was certainly an element of greatness to Joseph Seligman, because for every Seligman brothers that came, there were the Schulman brothers that didn't make it. And so
the Schulman brothers are great.
The Schulman brothers didn't quite make it to that level of dynasty, but they are great. But the Seligmans, Joseph Seligman was actually like a very highly educated man, which was difficult to become in Germany during that era. He came over in the 1830s, so he came over about 10 years before some of the other people that I write about in my book, who came really because of the revolutions that occurred in Europe during that time. He was just incredibly smart. He had an entrepreneurial instinct. They gravitated from Philadelphia to Alabama because there was less competition for them there. And the one thing that unifies all of these people that I write about is that they understood when it was time to get out of the clothing and dry goods businesses that they were in, and when it was time to make the leap into something else. And so they very much positioned themselves to become bankers after the Civil War, when it became possible to do that. But the interesting thing about Joseph Seligman, and I write about this in my book, is that you sort of see the Horatio Alger myth in Joseph Seligman. It's the sort of up from nothing tale. And then it's interesting to find out later on that Alger actually lived in Joseph Seligman's home and tutored his children. And at night,
Yes.
Joseph and Horatio Alger would have long conversations about his life. And at least Seligman's descendants believe that helped to, he was a prototype for some of the Alger characters.
Yeah, I mean, there would seem to be no question if he lived in his house. And that's a very secular image. That's not a specifically Jewish thing. He was not terribly religious. Is that correct?
That's another interesting thing about many of the people that I write about, is they really were not very religious, and they became less so as time went on in the United States. And certainly when you're talking about the second generation, there was very much an effort to assimilate into American culture that began, from day one. And in many cases that involved sort of shedding their Jewishness to some extent. I find very little evidence that anyone was, they certainly weren't keeping kosher or anything like that when they got to the United States, even though they might have been doing that in the old country.
Or were they? In other words, did they come? They came from German families. Some of them were sort of early Reform, and weren't. In the case of, I believe, Otto Kahn, he's not very religious at all.
No, they said he was the flyleaf between the Old and New Testament. Yeah,
that was a setup line. We didn't set this up, folks. That was a setup line.
Yes, very much so. I mean, and there was, but in terms of on the religious spectrum, Jacob Schiff, who's the main figure in my book, was really the most devout. But he too was a Reformed Jew, and he sort of pretended to keep kosher while sneaking bacon here and there, and eating lobster, that sort of thing. So, which is to say, he was not keeping kosher.
Right. Yeah. So that's right. That's right. Although my mother would never dream of having pork in the house, ever, ever, ever. All the food that came in the house was kosher. It didn't always get eaten in a kosher way, but she would eat lobster at a restaurant. Right? Why? I don't know. It was just and I should say that this book is very meaningful to me personally, because I did live most of my childhood in Alabama, where my father was managing a dress factory. My aunt and uncle are buried in Salem Fields, in the shadow, literally in the shadow of the Warburg Mausoleum, right nestled in between the Warburgs and the Rothschilds and all that stuff. The only thing missing was the money. But it is, and I think you make a point of saying this. You do make a point of saying this at the start of the book, in the preface. This is a history not just about these Jews, but for all Jews and for all immigrants. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting. It's an interesting thing, because as I started to work on this book, I realized I became interested in Jacob Schiff. Just to give you a little bit of background on him, he was. In the late 19th century and the 20th century, there was no more famous banker than Jacob Schiff. It was Jacob Schiff and J.P. Morgan. And while Morgan is often thought of as the most, preeminent banker of his day, probably the most influential banker in modern American history, I think I would argue that Schiff could assert a claim to that title and never really got his historical due, perhaps because he was Jewish. But the linkage I discovered, my dad, I think your dad grew up in Williamsburg too, right, Dan?
My mother.
Yeah. His family, he grew up in Williamsburg. His parents immigrated from what was then, my grandmother didn't really know where she was from. She thought Poland, she thought Austria. My grandfather came but they all came over during these waves of immigration that occurred in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And I came to realize that really it was made possible in many ways by Jacob Schiff. and his allies during that era, and that they would have known the name Schiff, because there was no more famous banker at that time, and there was no more famous American Jew. He was really the de facto leader of the American Jewish community. And when I say he made it possible to immigrate, he and members of the Goldman and Sachs and Seligman and Warburg families, among many others in the German Jewish philanthropic set, banded together to both push back on nativist immigration restrictions and make it possible literally for Jews to come here. But also they founded a dizzying network of social welfare organizations that helped Jews thrive when they got here. Everything from English lessons, coal for their furnaces, and things that helped them to jobs and job training programs, things that helped them to rapidly acculturate. And they really just played a pivotal role in what was forming the cornerstone of American Jewish life in America.
Mm-hmm. But was it so throughout the book, we have, and this is what I was getting at with the earlier question about, is there a type of person? There isn't a single culture. You see a big division. Both the Lehmans and the Seligmans are in Alabama, and they're starting to do pretty well. The Seligmans first, and then the Lehmans not long after. Meyer Lehman, is that right?
Meyer and Emanuel, yeah.
Right. The Seligmans leave to go back to the North, eventually New York, in the pre-Civil War era, or right around this. You mentioned Dred Scott, because they see the writing on the wall. The Lehmans not only stay, but they own slaves, and the Seligmans never own slaves, and they're like, we're out of here. This isn't who we are. And is that a division that stands for something broader throughout the bankers in this book and Jews broadly?
It was a very interesting thing, So I wrestled with the question of how did the Lehmans, who settled in Montgomery, Alabama, as you note, got involved in the cotton trade through their dry goods business, owned slaves, and after the Civil War, actually, and they might have been doing it pre-Civil War, I didn't find evidence of this, but after the Civil War, they were running plantations, and the system wasn't much better than slavery at that point. So how did Jews, whose foundational story is the flight of Jews from Egypt, rationalize being involved in a slaveholding culture? It turns out there were many Jews that lived in the South during that era who, many in an attempt to assimilate and to feel more white, really adapted to that slave-holding society. But of course, not everyone was comfortable with that. And the hypocrisy of it was lost on no one during that era. There was a fascinating debate in Congress where a lawmaker was mentioning Egyptians with Israel. I'm getting the whole thing wrong, but it was basically calling out Jews in the South who were taking part in slavery. So the Seligmans were not comfortable with that, and they moved north prior to the Civil War. And of course, the Lehmans became quite involved with the Confederacy, and the Seligmans got involved with selling bonds on behalf of the Union.
So is that division? It seems to me that sort of pragmatic versus moralist division persists throughout the book with various characters, including, the most interestingly, Jacob Schiff within himself, because he's doing some things, especially with the railroads, that he wouldn't look back upon his death and say, I'm terribly proud of that. But on the other hand, he's building a tremendous community.
It was definitely a different time in terms of the business practices of that era. I mean, it was a freewheeling time. There was almost no financial regulation. But it was interesting to see how they operated. And certainly Schiff and JP Morgan were involved in building monopolies. And in fact, their efforts ended up leading to some of the first anti-monopoly laws and to the creation of the Federal Trade Commission. and things of that nature. So like,
Right.
you know, it's interesting that a lot of the antitrust policies flow from that era.
Right. So that doesn't come until you have through the 19th century, you have the rise of merchant banking, investment banking, insurance, and the National Banking Act in 1918, I guess 63 or 2. And this leads to the rise of both the railroad monopolies and to what we now call investment banking. And in the middle of that is Kuhn Loeb. Right. So is Kuhn Loeb even more than the Seligman company? Is that the sort of first most important investment banking, at least among the Jewish bankers?
The Seligman Bank, during its heyday, was one of the biggest investment banks in the United States. Joseph Seligman, interestingly, was very consciously modeling his banking business on what the Rothschilds had done. And what the Rothschilds had done is formed different outfits. You know, they had one in Germany, they had one in London, they had one in Paris. And he very consciously modeled their banking operation based on what the Rothschilds had done. And in fact, even when they found a insurance company that would underwrite them who had worked with the Rothschilds, you know, Joseph Seligman was ecstatic because that meant he was you know, almost in their orbit. So Joseph Seligman, extremely influential during his era, not only in banking but in advising the Grant administration and subsequent administrations on financial and economic policy. Jacob Schiff, who was about 20 years younger, as Joseph Seligman dies in I think it was 1880, and Jacob Schiff, who is the leading partner in Kuhn Loeb, is ascendant at that time. And Kuhn Loeb very quickly, based on Schiff's connections and the business deals that he's doing, very quickly surpasses the Seligman firm.
Right. So Jacob Schiff, he marries a daughter of Loeb.
He marries Therese Schiff, who was the daughter of Solomon Loeb, who was one of the co-founders of Kuhn Loeb, and that firm had started out in Cincinnati. It was called Kuhn Netter at that time, and it was a fairly large clothing business that during the Civil War ended up getting a lot of federal contracts, and it was, even then, it was prior to the Civil War, it was pretty well established. By the time the Civil War was over, Solomon Loeb was well on his way to being a millionaire at that point, and that's when he decides to move to New York and found this investment bank.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And do they become big and powerful before Jacob Schiff, or does he really make that firm?
I think he really makes the firm. Jacob Schiff joined, you know, a few years after its founding. He marries Loeb's daughter Therese a few years after its founding, and Schiff is different from this earlier group of German Jewish immigrants, including the Lehmans and his father-in-law, in that this earlier group really didn't have any formal financial training, and they had come to the United States with few means, often by way of steerage. Jacob Schiff did not come to the United States by way of steerage. He came from a fairly prominent and well-established family in Frankfurt. There were people that were involved in finance and mercantile trades on both sides of the family. So he had worked in banking before he came to the United States. So he knew what he was doing. And you know, he came to the United States when he was 18 years old, and he had formed his own firm. It was called Bud Schiff and Company, before he was even 20 years old, and immediately plunged into railroad finance, which was which was pretty risky during that era.
So Jacob Schiff is like a lot of these people. He's driven. He's a little bit. He's not a little bit. He's a very complicated person because he's not, as we discussed, he's not very religious. But he becomes not an ardent, but the ardent defender of human rights in Russia for Jews and in other countries. And the sort of, I guess you'd say, the major fighter for Jewish immigration here, Jewish settlement, all kinds of Jewish cultural issues. He's not terribly religious, but we later find out that he's not a Zionist. He doesn't. He doesn't believe in Jewish nationalism, yet he believes in all these Jewish causes.
So what's interesting about Schiff is that, he was raised in an Orthodox family, and he did keep some of these traditions, but one of his grandsons said that he often performed a lot of ceremonies in a very distinct way. He kind of had his own rituals. But he did go to, temple weekly. He wouldn't drive there. He would only walk. But
Temple Emmanuel.
Yeah, to Temple Emmanuel, and he was also a member of a temple called. He was also a member of a temple called Bethel. But what was interesting, and you bring up Zionism, initially the German Jews were the elite, and they were the dominant factor in American Jewish life. There was not many Jews living in America at that time. In the span of about 20, 30 years, the Jewish population in the United States, this is spanning 1890 to 1920, goes from 400,000 to 3.4 million. And many of these new arrivals are fleeing pogroms in the Russian Empire, in the Pale of Settlement, which begin in 1880 after the assassination of the Tsar, which was blamed on Jews there. Now, the same conditions that end up causing these floods of immigration to the United States are what forms the basis for Zionism. As Zionism starts taking hold in the United States, often imported by immigrants to the country, Schiff and his German Jewish allies really view that as a threat. They saw the United States as their Zion. They saw it as their refuge and their homeland. This was, the United States was among the first countries where Jews could live, work, and worship freely. So they saw this as a Jewish refuge. They also viewed it as a threat because they were afraid of stirring up. They were always very cognizant of anything that would arouse anti-Semitism. They were trying to stamp that out wherever they could. And they were worried about this, lending credence to this medieval charge that Jews had dual loyalties and could not be trustworthy citizens of any nation because they were only loyal to themselves. Now, the argument starts to change over the years, first with World War I, with the Balfour Declaration, which makes a Jewish homeland in Israel a possibility. And Schiff was long dead by this point, but obviously World War II made a different sort of case in favor of Zionism, and the fact that Jews needed a refuge to where they could control their defense and immigration policy. And of course, prior to World War II, immigration policies in the United States and elsewhere had made it impossible for not just Jews, but refugees of all types to immigrate.
So Schiff has made himself a great American, a household name, not just in New York and not just in the industry. Really, was he during the peak of his powers in the fight over Union Pacific a household name in the country?
Yes, he was definitely a household name. What was interesting after this fight over the Union Pacific, he had helped to restructure and turn around what the bankrupt Union Pacific was, which was one of the marquee transcontinental railroads in this country. But in doing so, that had propelled him into a clash with J.P. Morgan and J.J. Hill, who was one of Jacob Schiff's good friends. Now, after this epic clash, which leads to a panic on Wall Street, which gets all these guys into trouble, and leads directly to one of the landmark antitrust cases that forms the basis of our antitrust laws. Yes, it was very much he was very much a household name, and in fact, at that point, the newspapers were saying, maybe he's surpassed J.P. Morgan in this era in terms of railroad finance. Maybe he's the bigger factor.
So all this time, these are well-known people, and there's anti-Jewish sentiment because lots of things are happening. These Jewish banking houses are amassing power. They are creating, at least vying for, the railroad monopolies and later the retail monopolies. I guess you wouldn't call Sears a monopoly, but the retail behemoths. And they're attracting both positive sentiment and negative sentiment. So is that sort of exaggerating what we still see and what we see throughout history as the fight for and against Jews and the anti-Semitism that's happening? Is that, in other words, what's the fervor of anti-Semitism broadly in the culture at the time, and how are they being a target of it?
That's very interesting because a lot of historians said really there wasn't much anti-Semitism in the country up until like the early 20th century, and that really isn't quite true. But it did not prevent Jews from forming these empires. It didn't prevent them from holding many different jobs. When you look back at the credit reports for the Lehman Brothers when they first went to Alabama, it's interesting because all of the entries make some reference to their Jewishness. Lehman Brothers, they stand good on their accounts, but they're of that tribe where they can't be trusted. Things like that. And over a period of years, you can see how their standing changes. On the cusp of the Civil War, there was an entry that said, Lehman Brothers, almost as good as white men, sort of thing. So there was anti-Semitism during the Civil War. There was a very famous anti-Semitic episode where Ulysses Grant barred Jews from the military jurisdiction that he was overseeing at that time. Joseph Seligman in the 1870s was barred from a resort in Saratoga Springs, and it was covered widely, and I think this had a huge psychological impact on Jews. But the place where the game starts to change is in the wake of World War I. And one thing that really amazed me doing this book was when you trace the roots of anti-Semitism, how much of it goes back to just one person. And people know him as America's foremost automaker, but Henry Ford was arguably his most important legacy was as the world's foremost purveyor of anti-Semitic myth through.
I don't know if that's his most important legacy, but
I think it is because people describe it as a footnote of his career. The modern anti-Semitism flows from Henry Ford and the Dearborn Independent newspaper, which for 7 years, over 92 issues, week upon week, attacked Jews for everything you can imagine, from wars to financial panics to wrecking American baseball to the popularity of jazz music, which it claimed was a Jewish creation that was degenerating American society. And all of this was
Benny Goodman is very big, one of the biggest names, a little bit later, 30s. So, but why, if the Jewish banking houses have so much interest in preserving, in fighting anti-Jewish tropes, anti-Semitic tropes, and if they have so much power throughout the book, various Schiff and Seligman and the Warburgs and the Lehmans are on the phone with presidents, whether it's Cleveland or Taft or Wilson. I don't know if it's a different world or if they're just at that level of power. They're picking up the phone or not picking up whatever you pick up, the telegraph, and they're communicating directly with the president of the United States. Why can they do nothing about this Henry Ford when they control so much of the supply chain financially?
It's interesting because Schiff died in 1920. Ford's anti-Semitic campaign begins in 1920.
Paul Warburg is still there, his son-in-law.
Paul Warburg is still there, but these were just, there was not another. When Schiff died, it was the end of a sort of era. And I think they did try many things in order to curb this campaign of Ford's, including lawsuits. Kuhn Loeb investigated filing a lawsuit against Ford, and their lawyer at the time, who was a member of the Goldman family, said these are some of the most serious charges I've ever seen in print, because Ford was basically accusing Jacob Schiff of funding the Bolsheviks, causing the Bolshevik Revolution, even orchestrating the murder of the Tsar and his family. And that was just like the tip of the iceberg. So they did try some lawsuits. Schiff, it's interesting because throughout his life, he always stood up he was always the first to fight back against this sort of thing. And when Henry Ford's campaign started, and he was in the final months of his life, he said, I don't think we should respond to this. I think we let it die out instead of fanning the flames of this fire. What he didn't realize was that it was a terrible miscalculation, because that fire had already started burning and it would never.
Or was it?
Never stop.
You say it was a terrible miscalculation, but let's cut to the present. And we see a backlash. Right now, we're obviously engaged in the war in Gaza and Israel.
Yeah.
I believe we're safe in saying it's the biggest backlash against certainly Israel and arguably the Jews in 2 generations, at least since 1967. And it has to do with, in the eyes of the protesters, the projection of Jewish power. And so Jacob Schiff represented the projection of power. Wasn't he legitimately concerned about that?
Oh, yeah, I think he was very concerned about any move that they would make that would worsen anti-Semitism in the United States. He was alarmed by what was starting to take place, because going back a few decades, there was anti-Semitism, there was social separation, there were separate Jewish and Christian clubs in places that Jews might not go.
Yes.
But things suddenly started to take a much more ominous turn, especially with Ford, and a lot of the stereotypes and the tropes. And I distinguish modern anti-Semitism. There are sort of 2 phases. There's medieval anti-Semitism, and then there's modern anti-Semitism, which is really based on the themes of the protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Right.
The person who brought the protocols of the Elders of Zion to the United States, they did not circulate widely. They were printed first in 1903. They didn't circulate widely until after World War I. The person who did that was working closely with Henry Ford. His whole campaign was based on the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So when you hear things like globalist or international banker, and it's anti-Semitic code, a lot of that flows from this era.
See, this is the enigma here, and it's central, I think, to thinking about the themes in this book. The Jewish bankers are globalists, right? In this internationalists, in the positive sense. They are forming international trade ties. They have affiliates in England. They have affiliates in France. They have affiliates in Germany. They have affiliates. Do they in Japan? I know there's some work in Japan later. But
if you have.
Right. But and so there is that globalist sort of activity, and yet it's viewed correctly as an anti-Jewish trope when they are accused of being globalists. Where is the intercept there? Is it because the accusation is that they're trying to control the world?
Yes, I think. I mean, they were certainly international. J.P. Morgan was international. He had
Sure.
banks in he had branches in Paris. He had branches in London. But so yes, they were certainly international bankers. But yes, the allegation was that they were not loyal to the United States, which couldn't have been further from the truth. Schiff and the others who I write about were fiercely devoted to the United States. They were extremely patriotic, and that was one of the reasons why they were so against Zionism. But yes, at the root of that is this idea that they're operating internationally, and there's some sort of conspiracy that's going on to subvert the United States.
To subvert the United States, but there is not a conspiracy because it's not conspiratorial, but there is banking activity that's global. And of course, as you said, it's not just the Jewish banks, it's Brown Brothers, which, by the way, Brown Brothers is much more international than any of these, I would guess. And they are enriching themselves, right? They're getting rich. They're becoming American aristocrats. Is this part of where the tropes come from?
Absolutely. I mean, Henry Ford deeply believed that German Jewish financiers were at the root of World War I. Henry Ford was a pacifist. He was extremely opposed to the war and had attempted to broker peace on a very sort of unofficial diplomatic mission that the papers derided during his era, which I don't think he liked very much. Right. But he believed that German, not bankers, but German Jewish bankers were at the root of that war. And he claimed that, some sources had given this information to him. Right. But it was all nonsense, obviously.
It doesn't stop him from making money making tank engines, of course.
Certainly the contradictions with Ford too. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So right. So Jacob Schiff is pro-Germany, not pro-German, pro-Germany for the until the Lusitania happens. And even then, or was he even then? And he's trying to get financing for the Germans in the war.
It was
World War I.
It's very interesting. World War I was just a fascinating period for German Jews in the United States, because this is the point where their identities completely come into conflict. Jacob Schiff always used to speak proudly of the trinity of his heritage as, he considered himself an American first and a Jew, and someone who was proud of his German heritage. During World War I, increasingly, it became very difficult to be pro-German in the United States. Initially in the war, Germany made some overtures to get Kuhn and Loeb to finance them. And Jacob Schiff initially did, to a very small degree, much less than they would have wanted. But then for almost the duration, up until the United States entered the war, which took a few years, he kept Kuhn and Loeb out of any German or pro-ally business. And this was really what ended up damaging Kuhn and Loeb's legacy pretty severely, because it eventually got a very pro-German reputation at a time that the country was increasingly anti-German.
And of course, Warburg, his son-in-law, Paul Warburg, is a member of the firm, is a partner in the firm. And right. The Warburg affiliate is a very large banking house in Germany. I believe Hamburg, is that right?
Yep, Warburg is in Hamburg. It's an impossible time for these guys to operate. Paul Warburg goes from being a partner in Kuhn and Loeb to a board member of the Federal Reserve, which he helped to bring into existence. This is the pinnacle of his career. And World War I breaks out, and he serves for a short amount of time, but is not renominated, largely because of his German heritage. And obviously he too he immigrated from Germany in 1900. His family is there. It's impossible for him to be against his country until America enters the war.
Right. But to be fair, this was Germany in World War I was one imperialist power fighting against other European imperialist powers. There was not ethnic cleansing, genocide happening. There was not one side built on ethnic hatred the way World War II happened. So it's a little more acceptable than it was 25 years later.
It was up until a certain point. The sinking of the Lusitania was just a landmark moment where public opinion shifted quite dramatically. And at that point, I think it was pretty difficult to be pro-German in the United States. And, really the big reason why Schiff refused to fund the Allies had to do with the fact that he didn't want any money going to Russia. And at that time, England was allied with Russia, and any loan, the money was being shared among those countries. And he refused to do anything that would aid Russia because of its treatment of the Jews.
Well, I want to ask you an unfair question, and that is, given this enigmatic character, Jacob Schiff, and all he did, what would he say today about what's happening in Israel and Gaza? It's an unfair question. You can declare that it's.
I've tried to think about this too, because obviously, Jacob Schiff would be probably, he'd be very proud of certain things in terms of what's happening today. He'd be so proud of the American Jewish community in the United States today and what it's become. In terms of what's happening in Israel and Gaza and the mounting anti-Semitism, he would be just horrified. He would be horrified. Maybe he would say, "I told you so." I don't know. But again, he did not live to see the Holocaust, and he did not live to see the doors of immigration slammed shut in the United States, making it impossible for the immigrants who he had helped, the millions of immigrants who he had helped over the preceding decades, come to the United States. But I think he would be deeply disturbed to see what's going on now.
So he does all this work to bring immigrants, help bring in immigrants, and to resettle immigrants, in some cases as far away as Galveston, Texas, which is a sort of an experiment. But he's doing all this work to try and integrate the society. And yet, in none of these, neither in his nor in others of these Jewish banking houses, do you ever see the East European from the Pale Ashkenazi Jews who come over as rabble rise to become partners in any of these firms, even though some have gone to Harvard and Yale and Columbia.
Later on, some of these Jews would become, would go enter Wall Street. But what's interesting is that the German Jews had almost nothing in common with the Eastern European and Russian immigrants that were coming, other than their religion. There was just there was a culture clash. And you see this sort of start to play out quite dramatically in the early 19th century, including with the clashes among the Zionists and the members of the labor movement, and socialists and folks of that nature. It's very interesting to see all of these groups try to unite and work together in common purpose, coming from so many different cultural and ideological perspectives.
Right. So in the case of all these banks are, would you say they're tied together through marriage and linkages, or do they happen to be sort of separate? I see Lehman Brothers as being a little bit more separate from some of the rest, but through all these ties, is it viewed at the time as this one monolithic entity, these Jewish banking houses? Like there's a book, here it is. It's the book. I should be able to hold it up, but it's in another room. Is it a monolith, or are they separate and completely separate companies like J.P. Morgan and Brown Brothers and so forth?
It was interesting because while they did do business together, Kuhn and Loeb was at a level much, much beyond Lehman or Goldman Sachs. They were fairly small firms during their time. They were not involved in railroad finance to the degree that Kuhn and Loeb was. So Kuhn and Loeb almost worked more closely with J.P. Morgan than it did with Goldman Sachs. No, but they were very distinct firms. But what bound them together was both marriages between families. One of Schiff's brother-in-laws was Isaac Newton Seligman, who would go on to run the J&W Seligman and Company. One of his best friends was Sam Sachs of Goldman Sachs. He worked alongside Meyer Lehman in philanthropic efforts. So really outside of business, these men had very close and close personal ties.
Mm-hmm. So I want to get to a question or a comment, but I first want to, one of the main takeaway points here of both the book and I hope of this conversation is that it was not just in the amassing of power and influence, it was in very specific reforms that this group of German Jewish bankers had made an imprint on American life. And in one relatively short period, you have the rise of the income tax, you have the birth of the Federal Reserve, which is the first central bank. Europeans had central banks, but the US was a completely sort of chaotic national bank system where a national bank would be chartered, but they all sort of fought among themselves in respect to the currency. And then you have the anti-monopoly, antitrust laws. All three happen within a few years of each other. Is that a coincidence? Is that, and to what degree do these Jewish bankers have their fingerprints on these three reforms that are reverberating today?
Well, I mean, I think what ends up happening is the Gilded Age gives way to the Progressive Era. There's a backlash against many of the robber barons of that era, and this sort of populist energy gives fuel to some of these reforms. Now, the Federal Reserve, when Paul Warburg got to the United States in the early 1900s, there was no central bank. Our current currency was inelastic, so it wouldn't contract or expand with demand, and there were bank panics all the time. But he was absolutely vital to the push for the Federal Reserve. He was literally in the room when it was designed with Senator Nelson Aldrich, or at least the early version of it. The progressive income tax, the income tax itself, one of the main crusaders for that was Joseph Seligman's son, Edwin Seligman, who was a Columbia-trained economist. He was the forefather of the progressive income tax on which our tax system is based. Now, in terms of some of these other reforms, they were indirect results of the monopolistic practices that Jacob Schiff and J.P. Morgan were involved in. There was a major investigation called the Pujo investigation into the money trust that involved both Morgan and Schiff, which led to the formation of the FTC and the Clayton Antitrust Act.
A participant, Joanne, is from Detroit. We baby boomers growing up in a Jewish suburb of Detroit knew that Jews did not buy Ford products. I have some familiarity with that, but not as much as you do, Joanne. We also knew that millions of Catholics, local and national, were rabid followers of Ford's anti-Semitic partner, Father Coughlin, whose incendiary radio show and massive, ominous bunker-like cement church, Shrine of the Little Flower, stood ominously on Woodward near 12 Mile Road. Again, we get back to that same question. Should there have been a firmer backlash to this in the pre and post World War II era?
I think that there should have been, although the American Jewish Committee pushed back pretty hard, and they when this first started happening, they wrote to Henry Ford and asked him to stop this, and they got a very bellicose letter in reply from the Dearborn Publishing Company saying your rhetoric is that of a Bolshevik orator. We will continue to publish. And again, there were lawsuits, but it took 7 years for them to be settled, and in that time there was a profound impact on Jews in the United States that is still being felt, quite honestly.
So there are, as with any large group of people, scandals. Anytime you have well-known people, there are scandals. And there was a thing called the Brandt affair, which becomes, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right,
Yeah.
Brandt is the Swedish footman.
Yes.
And we don't have too much time left, but just briefly talk about that in terms of how it became a big national scandal and whether that contributed to some of this anti-Semitic fervor.
I think, I mean, it's quite possible that so this fellow was a servant to Mortimer Schiff and his wife Adele. Mortimer was Jacob's son. Essentially, the allegation was that Brandt had an affair with Adele and was at their home one night and bonked Morty over the head with a bowling pin. He ends up going to jail.
Because they had a bowling alley in their basement.
Because they had a bowling alley in their basement. He ends up going to jail, and the allegation comes out a couple years later as Brandt is writing to anyone who he can imagine, saying, "Oh, the reason I've been railroaded is because I was having an affair with Adele, and they didn't want this to come out." It turns out that probably, wasn't true, and he seemed to just be kind of unstable, but this scandal was very much used to attack Jacob Schiff by various quarters, and it did go to this idea that Jews were plotting nefariously. Basically the allegation was that Morty and others had conspired to, again, railroad this poor lowly Swede.
See, as a prurient reader, I was dying to know whether you could tell me whether Brandt really did have an affair with Adele, because lots of people were having lots of affairs in that family anyway.
I would have assumed that would have been possible, and there were, certainly there were affairs, and I don't think anyone thought that those two were faithful to each other. The reason why I concluded that it probably didn't happen was based on some letters that I read from Brandt, who, they thought Brandt had died in World War I, and then they end up getting a letter for him, like 10 or 20 years later. But my conclusion was that, based on what he wrote, that there wasn't, that an affair had not occurred.
Right. So I thought it was interesting, and I compliment you for some of the great details in the book, including Jimmy Warburg, while a student at Harvard during World War I, becomes an aviator. Right? Yeah. He's training as an aviator, and after his first sort of dangerous pass, he goes and hires a prostitute, because if he's going to be an aviator, he doesn't want to die a virgin. This is the nephew of Paul Warburg, I believe, right?
Yeah, he put that he put that detail in his own book, thankfully.
Oh, he did.
Yeah, he did. Yes, he did. So, but it was a fun and fascinating detail. Let's see. I see there's a couple other questions here. One wasn't Seligman the president of the Union League in Philadelphia? The Seligmans were members. Joseph and his brother were members of the Union League Club in New York. And there was a fascinating episode where Jesse's son, who tried to gain membership, was blackballed from the club, and that was another notable anti-Semitic moment in American history. There's another question. What are you interested in researching and writing about next? Oh boy, that's a tough question. I think I need a nap after working on this for 8 years, but part of me is interested in picking up where I left off, because this book really only goes up to around the Great Depression, and there's a whole another tale to tell, picking up with a lot of these same characters that carries on through World War II. And so that's potentially something that I'm interested in working on next.
Right. Now, we should mention that you did write about the Koch brothers.
Yes.
And so briefly, as we wind up, the Koch brothers also amassed tremendous power in business, also through advancing their libertarian interests, and I would argue some sort of neocon interests as well, have become icons. What comparisons did you see as you did this book?
One thing that's, I mean, certainly one comparison between is the way that blood and money can really cause a lot of problems, and that was one issue with the Koch brothers, where these brothers ended up fighting each other in court. There were four Koch brothers who ended up battling each other in court over control of the family company, and it was extremely bitter. But in the Money Kings, you see some of these same issues start to play out between Meyer Lehman and his brother-in-law over business deals, various clashes within these companies, which was fascinating. But one of the reasons why I wrote this book is because I'm interested in legacy, and I'm interested in influence, and I'm interested in dynasty, and I'm interested in the way that power works. So you see some similar themes, just in terms of the magnitude of the influence some of these families have on the modern world.
I should mention that these fortunes were equivalent to about $1 billion or $2 billion in today's dollars. And so what we're seeing with these $175 billion fortune of Amazon, there was nothing like that. This is a new world. And so I would leave you, now that I see Omar on screen here, with the last question, which is would you say that the legacy of these Jewish bankers exists only sort of in a murky way in the water, and that culture is gone? Or would you say that our civic and business culture is very much a reflection of what they did?
I absolutely think we're living in the world that these guys helped to build. No, there's no question about it, whether we look at some of our economic policies, but also just the American Jewish life in America. I come back to this a lot. It really would not exist as it does in its form today without these people. And then just on a basic level, if you take a stroll through New York, you look around and, that building was, established by this organization was established by, Joseph Seligman or Jacob Schiff. Many organizations that were founded back in that era exist today. Libraries, they were influential with various museums. So their legacy just really spans, again, finance, the Jewish community, culture, politics, and so on.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good place to end. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who was here as a participant. Omar?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, Dan, for being the moderator, and thank you so much, Daniel, for this very interesting topic.
Of course.
And thanks to everyone for joining us. I put links in the chat to purchase Daniel's book. Yeah, please join us again for a future program. And
Omar, I just wanted to mention that if folks want a signed book plate for their books or for gifts that they might want to give, I'd be happy to sign and send those. And I will drop my email in the chat. It's first name, last name, gmail.com. And just send me your address. And if you want it personalized, what you'd like it to say, and I would be happy to send one of those out to you. And thank you so much for joining this evening.
Yeah. I noticed that you put it just to hosts and panelists, so I'm just gonna.
Oh yes.
I'm just gonna send it to everyone. And when we close out the webinar here, if you miss it, just contact me and I'll put you in touch with Daniel.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Have a great evening, everyone, and have a good holiday.
Thanks.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. Yes.